7 years of input since the 1986 amnesty, and we still don't have secure borders. And now it's beyond time to guarantee not just more promises or inputs, but real outputs. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for an additional 2 minutes.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. The latest data show that the U.S. authorities apprehended about 190,000 people along the U.S.-Mexico border between October of last year and March of this year. Given that we apprehend fewer than half of illegal border crossers, this means we still have hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country across our southern border every year. And the problem, it won't surprise you, is particularly serious in my state because we have the largest common border with Mexico, 1,200 miles. As the New York Times reported this last weekend, the front line in the battle against illegal crossings from Mexico has shifted for the first time in a decade away from Arizona to the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Indeed, on one day in the Rio Grande Valley sector, the Border Patrol detained 700 people coming across the border. 400 of them were from countries other than Mexico. 400 of them. During the fiscal year, which began last October, the number of apprehensions in South Texas has increased by 55%, with more than 94,000 apprehensions just in the Rio Grande Valley. I was in South Texas a few weeks ago meeting with property owners, ranchers, law enforcement officials, and others deeply concerned about the rising tide of illegal immigration. But not only is this a national security issue because people are coming from countries other than Mexico, including countries that are of special concern because they're state sponsors of terrorism, this is also a major humanitarian issue. In Brooks County, last year, 129 bodies were found, people coming across ranch land after suffering from exposure because they've come from Central America, they've come from China, they've come from the Middle East. They've come from all over the country. And we've seen a sharp increase in the number of people die because they're trying to navigate our broken immigration system. One final point about immigration reform. Whatever legislation we pass in this chamber will necessarily have to go to the House of Representatives. If we want the Senate bill to have any chance of passing in the House and becoming law, we need to include real border security measures and a real border security trigger. Our House colleagues have made that abundantly clear. In other words, my amendment, Mr. President, is not a poison pill. It's the antidote, because it's the only way we're ever going to truly have bipartisan immigration reform. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allocated 8 minutes, that the remaining Democratic time be under the control of the Senator from Connecticut, Senator Murphy.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to add my support to S-744, the comprehensive immigration bill that we have been debating over the past week. I first want to thank the 8 senators who came together to draft this bipartisan bill. They've done an extraordinary job. And I want to particularly thank Senator Leahy for his brilliant leadership as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Immigration reform is an important priority that for far too long has been left unaddressed. We all agree the current system is broken. The bill before us is a realistic approach to fixing this broken system, and that is certainly better than continuing the failed status quo. Mr. President, I've long been an advocate for comprehensive and common-sense immigration reform that is tough but also fair. And standing here addressing my colleagues urging immigration reform, I cannot help but remember the 2006 and 2007 immigration debates and the many calls to pass immigration reform during that time and since that time. Today, 6 years later, we still have not passed needed reform, responded to the overwhelming call to do so from the American people, and moved our immigration system into the 21st century. Today, we once again have the chance to act and to pass comprehensive immigration reform. This bill includes strong border security measures to better protect our national security and to ensure that those trying to come to the United States with better opportunities do so legally. It calls for persistent surveillance of the entire border and for apprehension of 90% of illegal entries, and makes an investment in infrastructure and technology that we need to meet these tough goals. And the Secretary of Homeland Security would be required to submit both a comprehensive southern border security strategy and a southern border fencing strategy to Congress plans to achieve these goals before the 11 million immigrants waiting in the shadows can even begin the very tough but fair earned path to citizenship. This rigorous path includes criminal background and national security checks, paying fines, fees, and taxes, learning civics and English, and going to the back of the immigration waiting line. The bill before us also improves worksite enforcement to better protect all workers and wages, and makes changes to our immigration system that will help us retain the bright and talented leaders of tomorrow and reduce backlogs and inefficiencies. As we continue this debate, I am hopeful that the Senate will have the opportunity to consider 3 amendments that I have filed. In the 1990s, Liberian refugees fled a brutal civil war that killed more than 150,000 people and displaced more than half of the population. Since then, these individuals have been granted temporary protected status or deferred enforcement departure, granted by the administration because the conditions in their home country of Liberia were too dangerous for them to return. Many of these individuals have now been legally residing in our country for more than 20 years, paying taxes, holding jobs, being part of the community. Amendment number 1224 would clarify one aspect of the merit-based 2-track system, ensuring that it makes eligible these Liberians and others who are granted TPS or DED due to dangerous or inhospitable conditions in their home countries, and will meet the 10-year minimum requirement for long-term alien workers. This bill intended to include these populations. However, the long-term alien section of the bill uses the term, quote, lawfully present, unquote, and since this term is not defined by statute and could be subject to interpretation, these Liberians and others in similar situations could be inadvertently excluded from this track. The intention was always to include them. I asked my colleagues to work with me to correct this so that these deserving individuals, who 4 different presidents have supported, are not left behind on a technicality. The Second Amendment, number 1223, recognizes the long-standing role that libraries have played in helping new Americans learn English, American civics, and integrate into our local communities. It ensures that they continue to have a voice in these critical efforts. Across the United States, the libraries are cornerstones of all sorts of educational activities. In fact, according to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, more than 55% of new Americans use a public library at least once a week. Libraries offer learning opportunities for new Americans in a trusted environment. And we have to recognize the vital importance of libraries as we ask these individuals to come forward to learn English, to learn civics, to learn the skills that are so required to participate fully in the life of the American people. This amendment expands on the recent partnership we've developed with libraries so that they remain a keystone and a resource for new Americans. It would add the IMLS as a member of the Task Force on New Americans to help direct integration policy and clarify the role that libraries will continue to play in facilitating these services. Now, I've also filed an amendment with Senators Schumer and Casey, number 1223, that would upgrade the immigration bar on expatriate tax dodgers. I authored an amendment to the 1996 immigration law that prohibited citizens who renounced their citizenship in order to avoid taxation from re-entering the United States. I was prompted to act after hearing about a raft of wealthy U.S. citizens that gave up their citizenship to avoid paying taxes, but would obtain re-entry to the United States very easily and continue effectively to live their lives as Americans, even though they were, for tax purposes, foreigners. One of the more egregious examples was Kenneth Dart, a billionaire who in the early 1990s renounced his American citizenship to avoid paying U.S. taxes, became a citizen of Belize, and then was appointed by the government of Belize to be a consular officer in Sarasota, Florida, Mr. Dart's hometown. This ruse and other ruses like this must be stopped. My amendment would make it clear that the Immigration Service must stop this flouting of the status of avoiding taxes by changing your citizenship. Mr. President, I look forward to action on these amendments during this debate. This is an important debate. Indeed, the strong bipartisan vote that brought us to this moment procedurally captures the overwhelming recognition we need to fix the system. We need to move forward. This is a situation where we have a bipartisan bill that has overwhelming support in the United States. We must move it forward, amend it appropriately, as I've suggested, pass it, and then send it to the House with the hope and the expectation that the President will sign this bill, opening up a new era in this country for millions and millions who seek to be Americans. With that, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. President, rather, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Connecticut.
I'd ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there is so much good flowing through the veins of this country. We are, by and large, a compassionate, just people, and it hurts us deeply to see pain and suffering in places that don't enjoy the relative safety and security of America. And we are today, more so than ever before, a powerful people. We're the one remaining superpower with a military that dwarfs all others and a record of throwing our weight around in all corners of the globe. Mixed correctly, this combination of goodness and power, it can be transformational. It can lighten the load of oppressed peoples. It can lift up the disenfranchised. It can cure diseases. But there is one fatal trap that comes with these defining characteristics of 21st century America, a tripwire that has ensnared our nation too many times in recent history. This is the belief that there are no limits to what this combination of goodness and power can achieve. In a word, that trap is hubris. And, Mr. President, I rise today because I fear that we are on the verge of falling into this trap once again. In April, Mr. President, you and I, as well as several other members of the Senate and the House, visited the Kilis refugee camps along the border of Turkey and Syria. Now, these were reportedly the best of the refugee camps set up to shelter Syrian families fleeing the blood and carnage of that country's civil war. It's not a place that I would have wanted to have stayed for another hour. We met a girl who had had half her face scarred by a Syrian rocket attack. I met a little orphan boy whose parents had been felled by the ruthless tactics of Bashar al-Assad. We were there for an afternoon, but you didn't need to spend more than 10 minutes in that place to be deeply moved by the case of the refugees. And of course, Syria presents not only a humanitarian imperative, Syria is of immense strategic importance to the United States. The Assad regime has been a thorn in our side for years, and now his refusal to step down has created a bloody conflict that is in real time destabilizing a region that is critical to our national security interests. Even worse, the fight has drawn in Islamist groups affiliated with al-Qaeda, and a failure to root out their influence and reduce their presence threatens to hand them a new base of operation with which to plot attacks against Americans. So it's easy to see why American intervention is so tempting. It's easy to see why President Obama has chosen to act. A humanitarian crisis, a strategic interest, a uniquely American blend of goodness and power tells us that we must try to make things better. But here's the rub. It is not enough for there to be a will. There also has to be a way. And, Mr. President, today in Syria, I do not believe that there is that way. And I do not believe that this Congress should give the President the ability to escalate America's role in the Syrian conflict without a clear set of goals and a clear sense that we can achieve these goals. So let's start with the odds attached to our first objective, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. The unfortunate reality is that in Syria today, the momentum is with the Assad regime. With the help of Hezbollah and Qasem Soleimani, a senior Iranian Quds Force commander, Assad has driven the rebels from the key town of Qusair, and his forces are now battering the rebels' positions in Aleppo. American-supplied automatic weapons are not going to be enough to change this reality. And while anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, along with armored vehicles, could give the advantage to the Syrian opposition, This would frankly invite another more sinister problem. The Syrian opposition is not a monolithic force. It's an interlocking, sometimes interdependently operating, sometimes independently operating force. Our favored faction is the Free Syrian Army, but they are currently far from the most effective fighting force of the opposition. Today, the most effective unit is the rebels in Jabhat al-Nusra, an Islamic extremist group with demonstrable ties to al-Qaeda. If we give heavy weaponry to the FSA, there is virtually no way to guarantee that these weapons will not find their way to Jabhat al-Nusra, a group that represents the very movement that we are fighting across the globe. In fact, we've been down this road before. In the 80s, we gave powerful weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, freedom fighters that we supported in their war against the Soviets. Of course, as we all know, after kicking out the Soviets, those fighters later formed the foundation of the Taliban, providing the staging ground in Afghanistan for al-Qaeda's plans against the United States. So then let's take our second objective. Even if we are successful in toppling Assad, it matters to us greatly who takes the reins of Syria next. I can't imagine we are getting into this fight just to turn the country over to the al-Nusra Front or another Iranian or Russian-backed regime. But if we do care about which regime comes next, and we should, then we need to admit that we aren't intervening in Syria for the short run. We're in this for the long haul. Why? Because as we all learned in history class, these upheavals run a pretty predictable course. There's first the revolution, and then there is the civil war. Iran nor Russia will allow a U.S.-backed Free Syrian Army to simply stand up a new government. And certainly Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremist groups are not going to do the lion's share of the early fighting and then just walk away with no role in the new government. So then we've got to admit that we are, in the medium and in the long term, deciding to arm one side of what promises to be a very complicated, multi-front, heavily proxied civil war. Now, one may say that there's still an interest to negotiate the politics and the military logistics of this second conflict. To that, I would ask, what is the evidence that we've ever gotten this tightrope right in the past? Recent history tells us that America is pretty miserable at pulling the strings of Middle Eastern politics. In Afghanistan, after 10 years of heavy military presence, many experts think that when we leave, the place is going to look pretty much like it did before we got there. If we can't affect change with tens of thousands of troops, how are we going to do it in Syria with just guns and cash? And there is a risk that our assistance could actually make things worse. Won't it embolden the Iranians or the Russians or the extremists to fight harder against the new regime if they know that they are backed by American money and arms? As we saw in our disastrous occupation of Iraq, American presence often attracts extremists, not repels them. Our money and our arms, they become bulletin board material for extremist groups around the globe. Why would we want to help al-Qaeda's recruitment by putting a big red, white, and blue target on Damascus for years to come? The bottom line is this, Mr. President. Not everywhere where there is an American interest is there also a reason for American military action. In Syria, with a badly splintered opposition, a potential nightmare follow-on civil war, I believe that the odds are slim that a U.S. military assistance will make the difference that the President believes it will make. And I worry that our presence could harm, not advance, our national security interests. There is, thankfully, another way. Given the atrocities occurring within Syria and the potential for further destabilization of the region, the United States cannot and should not just simply walk away from Syria. We should dramatically increase our humanitarian aid both inside and outside Syria. We should help improve conditions at the refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan and help other nations bearing the burden of displaced persons like Lebanon and Iraq deal with the influx of people. Put simply, we should concentrate our efforts on humanitarian help inside Syria and on making sure the conflict doesn't spill out outside of Syria's borders. And at the very least, our nation's role in Syria deserves a full debate in Congress before America commits itself to a course of action with such potentially huge consequences for our national interest. According to published press reports, the administration has indicated that it does not intend to seek congressional approval before shipping arms to the Free Syrian Army, at a time, I would note with some irony, when the United States still officially recognizes the Assad government. Now, the Foreign Relations Committee has done its work here, and I commend Chairman Menendez. We have had hearings. We have held a debate and a vote on a resolution. But now that the President has announced these new steps, it is incumbent upon the full Senate to ask questions of the administration's short-term and long-term goals and to debate the consequences of American intervention fully. This is serious business, and the American public deserves a full debate. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
This consent proceedings on the quorum call be suspended. I address the senators up in morning business, and I want to thank the chair for his patience to allow me these few extra minutes and preventing him
Without objection, Senator from Arizona.
from enjoying a sumptuous repast with his colleagues on the Democratic side. I intend to speak until 1 o'clock, 12:45.
You can speak as long as you like.
Mr. President, I'll speak rather quickly. There's a lot to say about the immigration bill, and obviously there are amendments that are pending. One, the Thune Amendment would delay the process of bringing people out of the shadows until 350 miles of double-layer fencing is complete. This could have the impact of delaying the process for years. I note with some interest that the senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn, believes that there's no more fencing required in the state of Texas. Fencing is important. Surveillance is more important. This bill alone does, as it is presently written, includes $1.5 billion of fencing for the southern border as a trigger to begin adjustment of status for those in RPI status. But it doesn't arbitrarily dictate the number of miles of double-layer fencing that should be built. I think we should leave that to the best judgment of the Border Patrol. And I would point out that back in 2007, the senators from Texas added an amendment to an appropriations bill that said if the Secretary determines the use or placement of resources is not the most appropriate means to achieve and maintain operational control over the international border. We currently have 352 miles of pedestrian fencing, 298 miles of vehicle fencing along the southern border, which is where the Border Patrol said that it's most effective. The Vitter Amendment has the same limitations, and we agree. And in the bill, an exit-entry system is created, and the bill mandates that before anyone receives a green card, an entry-exit system must be in place in all air and sea capabilities. I want to remind my colleagues that keep referring back to 1986, and I was around at that time. There was no provision, real provision for border security there. There is provisions here, and I want to emphasize that we know exactly from the Border Patrol the technology that is needed in each sector in order to get 90% effective control of the border and 100% situational awareness, and these are detailed and important technology, which is the real answer to border security. And I am confident, I am absolutely confident, with the implementation of this technology-based border security systems that we can absolutely guarantee the American people, but more importantly, the head of the Border Patrol, and I'll have a statement from him by early this afternoon, the head of the United States Border Patrol will say that if we implement the technology, which they gave us the detailed list of, that he is confident that we can have 90% effective control of our border and 100% situational awareness. I hope that my colleagues will pay attention, those who are concerned about border security, and legitimately they are. I hope they will pay attention to the statement of the head of the Border Patrol, who says unequivocally that if we adapt these specific enforcement capabilities and technology, that we will be able to have control of our border. That is an important item in this debate, and it is incredible detail. We also, in this legislation, need to give them the flexibility where there's improved technology, etc. But those who think that we need more people, we do need more people to facilitate movement across our ports of entry. But we have 21,000 Border Patrol. Today, there are, in the Arizona-Mexico border, there is people sitting in vehicles in 120-degree heat. What we need is not more people, because we've gone, in 1986 we had 4,000 Border Patrol to 21,000, but what we need is the technology that has been developed in the intervening years, and I would be more than happy to say to my colleagues that if we have a provision that this strategy must be implemented and is providing 90% of Border Patrol control, that effective control, that would serve as a trigger. I hope that my colleagues will reject the pending amendments, the Vitter and Thune amendment, and we will move on with the legislative process. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
Senators have recessed so members can attend weekly party lunch meetings. They'll return at 2:15 Eastern for more debate on the immigration bill. Votes begin at 3 Eastern on 4 amendments dealing with the border fence, tracking visas, and adoption of foreign children. You can learn more about the members of the Senate in our congressional directory. It's a handy guide to the